Hello to you. I hope you're well. Welcome to this religious studies video. I'm Wardle, and today we're taking a look at the life of the Buddha. So in this video, we will be looking, as I say, at the life of the Buddha, including the foresights that led to him completely changing and transforming his life, that led to him leaving the palace, leaving his family, and committing himself to finding enlightenment. We'll be looking at some key quotes from the Dhammapada, which is one of our key sources of wisdom and authority when it comes to Buddhism. We'll be looking then at the Four Noble Truths taught by the Buddha, and finally at the Noble Eightfold Path that he advocates for all people to follow. So I absolutely love studying Buddhism. There is so much for us to learn from the life and teachings of the Buddha, even 2,000 plus years after he lived and left us with these amazing and insightful teachings. So plenty to talk about today. Let's get started, shall we, with a little overview of how it all began. So really important to note that the Buddha was born as a prince, and the prince who would become known as the Buddha, and that is the title that he has been given, which means the awakened one or the enlightened one. He was born into a wealthy Indian royal family called Gautama. So he was called Siddhartha Gautama. Now, his birth took place in Lumbini, which would be modern-day Nepal, just to bring you a bit of geography there if you're thinking whereabouts all of this took place on the world map. Very interesting that the founder of Buddhism was born into a very wealthy and luxurious life. You know, that's really in contrast to Jesus, for example, isn't it? Who was born in a stable. So the Buddha, or the man who would become known as the Buddha, because of course he was not enlightened at this stage, Siddhartha Gautama, was born into a royal family, into royal life, in a palace. Now, his mother was called Maya. When she became pregnant, we are told by tradition that she dreamed that she was visited by a white elephant that entered her womb. And then when her child was born, we are told again by tradition that he stood and walked 7 steps. Then he announced, "In heaven above and on earth below, I am the most honored one. I shall get rid of the suffering that fills the world." And then 7 days later, the Buddha's mother died. Now, we aren't saying that this literally happened, but this is a very important part of Buddhist tradition, these teachings and these stories about what happened in terms of his birth. Now, what I think is really significant here is the line that he's said to have said straight after he was born: "I shall get rid of the suffering that fills the world." This is very important because it sets the tone for everything we talk about when we're studying Buddhism. Buddhism is ultimately about this truth, the first noble truth, that life is suffering, and it's about how to overcome and escape from that suffering. And so whenever we're studying Buddhism, we're always bringing it back to this key idea of suffering, this idea that life is suffering, and that the Buddha is teaching us how to overcome suffering and then ultimately attain enlightenment. So soon after his birth, his father, who of course was the king, this is a royal family, they've been born into a very powerful setting, was visited by a wise teacher called Asita. Now, Asita was skillful at seeing the future, so a bit like your modern day, what are they called? Not astronomers, what are they called? Psychics. That's the one. Oh, it's going to be a good video, guys. So much like your modern day psychic, Mystic Meg kind of character. So Asita inspected the infant, he inspected the young prince, and he announced that he would grow up to be one of 2 things. He said, "I can see into the future, and I can see that he's going to be one of 2 things. And it will all depend on how he's been brought up and the things that he sees." He said he will either become a great, powerful, feared ruler, or he will become the greatest teacher the world has ever known. And just as a side note, a ceremony was then held to name the child. He was called Siddhartha. Now, Siddhartha's father, the king, heard this prediction from Asita about these 2 potential paths that his son could take as he grew up. And he decided, he knew that he wanted his son to become the great, powerful, feared leader. He did not want him going off and worrying too much about other people in the wider world outside. He wanted him to be this strong, powerful leader. And so he decided he would protect him from seeing what life was like for ordinary people, because he thought that if Siddhartha saw what life was like beyond the palace walls, when he saw that actually So many people were suffering. They were living in poverty, for example. They did not have the wealth and riches that were afforded to the royal family. He thought then he'd want to help those people and teach them rather than lead them. So he thought it would, it would weaken him, if you like. It would give him compassion for people when he thought that a strong leader needed to be feared, and he needed to be fearsome and strong and rule over them. And so he decided he would keep Siddhartha within a bubble. He would keep Siddhartha within the palace walls. He would not let him leave the palace. He would make sure he had everything he could possibly have ever wanted, all the entertainment, all the food, all the pleasures, but he never wanted him to leave. And so he made sure that his son Siddhartha never left the palace, and that he grew up instead in total luxury. And we could say, of course, as well, in total ignorance of the reality of the world outside. And ignorance is then one of the three fires, one of the three poisons that Buddha teaches about later on. So we will be coming back to that idea of living in ignorance soon. However, despite his father's best efforts, Siddhartha was curious and he wanted to know what's going on in the world. And so he did decide to leave the palace walls. And on these occasions, he saw what we now call the Foresights. And they're called the Foresights because they are literally 4 different things that he saw when he left the palace walls. He saw an old man and he realized that everybody ages. He saw a sick man and he saw that everybody gets sick. And he saw a dead man, and he realized for the first time that everybody is going to die. And then the 4th sight was something a little bit more positive. The 4th sight was a sadhu, a holy man who had rejected the world in order to live a spiritual life. So it was somebody who had rejected the luxuries and the indulgences of the world and had committed to living a very austere, a very disciplined life focused on spirituality. And so for the first time, remember, he'd never left the palace before. He just lived in total luxury within the palace walls. For the first time, Siddhartha realized that all beings suffer. There is no escape from suffering. No matter how much money you have, no matter where you live or what your status in society may be, you are going to suffer in your life because you're going to get old, you're going to get sick, and then you're going to die. And this is what he realized. And he thought, well, what's the point of life then? What is the point of being here if we're just all going to get old, sick, and then die? And so he started to question his life in the palace. And then he also started to question the purpose of human life as a whole, because he wanted to know, well, could we ever overcome this suffering? Could we ever be truly happy? Or is this just what our lives are? Are our lives just suffering, full stop, and that's it? Well, Siddhartha was determined to find a way to overcome life's suffering so that not just he could find happiness and contentment, but that all people could find it as well. And so despite his father's best efforts, he had developed this conscience, if you like. He had developed this awareness of not just his own suffering that he would be facing in the future. He realized he would get old, sick, and die, but also of all people's suffering. And so we could say that he's developing empathy, isn't he? And so, and this leads to a radical change in his life, he decided that he could not stay in the palace any longer. He was living in the palace, he was being entertained, he had all the food, all the luxury, all the wealth, everything he could possibly want. He even had a wife and child, but he realized that that could not make him happy, that simply having all these pleasures around him, all of these distractions, having all of this indulgence, that would not allow him to escape from suffering, because no amount of money could stop you from getting old, getting sick, and then ultimately dying. And so, he found himself with this mission, if you like. He found himself with this desire to find a cure for the suffering that all human beings experience. And so he left the luxury of the palace and his wife and child, as I say, and he himself became a sadhu. So he himself went off to live with a group of holy men who had rejected the world and worldly pleasures and, worldly possessions in order to live a spiritual life. Now, this event, when he sneaks out of the palace, he abandons his family and he abandons all of the wealth and luxury. This is known as the Great Renunciation because he is renouncing that royal life. He is renouncing the palace. He is renouncing the royalty, as I say, the wealth and the life of luxury in order to find real happiness. And I just think, if we think about this in the 21st century context, we do live in an age, don't we, in this capitalist age where we're told that the more that you have, the more money you have, the more possessions you have, the more designer brands you have, the more followers you have even. The more you have, the happier you will be. But actually, the message here from the Buddha is that no amount of money can ever make you happy, that you actually have to renounce those worldly pleasures and that worldly wealth in order to go and find happiness. Now, this is a really key moment in his life. And I think it gives us today a lot of food for thought as well in terms of, how do we find happiness in our lives? Is it through wealth? Is it through, acquiring more and attaining more? The message here is that absolutely not, isn't it? So what happens next? Well, as I say, he's renounced his wealthy and luxurious life as a prince, and he has become a sadhu. And so he spends 6 years with these holy men learning meditation techniques and other spiritual disciplines. However, it's important to note that he did not reach the goal he'd set himself to, discover a cure for suffering straight away. That did not suddenly happen just because he'd left that life of luxury. He spent some time practicing what we call asceticism. Now, this is basically severe self-discipline. So he'd gone from a life of complete overindulgence, where he'd had absolutely everything he could possibly wanted and more. And then he went and lived this life of severe self-discipline. And he did this, as I've put there, along with 5 holy men. This involved withdrawing from the world completely, giving up all physical pleasures and living as simply as possible. And so it meant, giving up your clothes. It meant giving up, as I say, your belongings, but also it meant giving up things like eating until he nearly starved himself to death. Now, the significant thing here is that this extreme did not bring him any closer to his aim either. So he'd realized that there were 2 extremes that did not lead to happiness. He tried, obviously, overindulgence in the palace, and he'd realized that would never solve suffering. And then he tried severe self-discipline, and he again realized that that did not alleviate suffering. That did not lead to happiness. And so, after practicing these 2 extremes, the life of overindulgence and then the life of asceticism, he realized that neither of those 2 extremes, the luxurious life or the complete removal of all physical comfort, could bring human beings true, lasting, and genuine happiness. And so he realized, as this image here on the screen demonstrates, that happiness must be found by treading a careful path between those 2 extremes, between those 2 polar opposites of overindulgence and then severe self-discipline. And this path, he decided, would be called the middle way, because you are literally walking in the middle of those 2 extremes. And in order to find happiness, in order to travel towards happiness and to overcoming suffering, you need to travel on that middle way. You need to travel that middle way, that balanced, centered, stable way of living. Basically, it is about a life of balance. It's a little bit like with the fairy tale. Is it a fairy tale? Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Can I call that a fairy tale? The nice little story anyway, where you've got the porridge, haven't you? And one of them is too hot. One of the bowls of porridge is too hot. One of the bowls of porridge is too cold. And then the one that we like is the bowl of porridge that is just right. Yeah, that's that very famous childhood story, isn't it? And the message is the same, that you don't want either extreme. You don't want to be too hot or too cold. You want to be just right. And this is the idea of the middle way. It's about balance. It's about stability, and it's about living a centered life. And as I say, this is very important because it's the path Buddha believes we need to follow in order to overcome suffering, attain enlightenment, and then achieve that higher state of true, genuine, lasting happiness, which Buddhism describes as nirvana, which is the extinguishing of the 3 fires, which we'll come on to later. And so for the Buddha to take the middle way means treading that careful path between the two extremes of luxury and hardship. And they are two things that Buddha experienced when he was a prince in the palace, and then when he was with the holy men practicing asceticism. And he discovered that you need to take the middle way between them. And it is when you're taking that middle way that you're in the best position to discover the truth about life, to overcome suffering and attain enlightenment. So it's all about balance. It's all about the middle way between those two extremes. And so, whilst he is now traveling along this middle way, Siddhartha sits down under the Bodhi tree to meditate, and he vows not to stop until he has gained the wisdom to overcome suffering and realize deep happiness, known as enlightenment. Now, enlightenment is our key core concept in Buddhism, and Buddhist writings suggest that enlightenment brings freedom, contentment, wisdom, compassion, fearlessness, determination, and peace. Now, when the Buddha attained enlightenment by meditating under the Bodhi tree here, as you can see, he was still a man. This is very important. Buddhists do not see Buddha as a god. He is still a man. You know, he was born as a prince into the palace. He left the palace, and now he has discovered, he has attained enlightenment. And so this is really important because it shows that all people are capable of attaining enlightenment as well. If they travel along the middle way, if they commit themselves to meditation practice, and if they then follow the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, they can achieve the same enlightenment as the Buddha, as Siddhartha Gautama did. And so this human potential to attain enlightenment is known as Buddha nature. The idea that we all have a Buddha nature within us, and so we can all become Buddhas, we can all become awakened and enlightened ones as well. So over the 45 years following his enlightenment, the Buddha gained a large following. So he did spend a lot of time teaching. You know, if you think Jesus died before he was 40, the Buddha, you know, he attained enlightenment and then he actually spent 45 years teaching. And in that time, as I say, he gained a large following. And his followers, his committed disciples, were known as bhikkhus. He encouraged those disciples, those followers, to live the middle way that he discovered and that he had traveled down himself, which meant, of course, balancing yourself between overindulgence and then severe self-discipline. So taking that middle way, that balanced, centered, stable life. Now, some of his followers were very committed to this, and so they would give up all of their possessions that were not necessary to live simply. And so remember, that doesn't mean then starving yourself, as Buddha tried with his practice of asceticism, but it means getting rid of anything unnecessary for living simply. So again, you know, getting rid of those distractions, getting rid of those overindulgences. And then in his first sermon, the Buddha taught his followers the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, which are at the very core of Buddhism. And we're going to talk about those in just a moment. The teachings of the Buddha are known as the Dharma, and many of his sayings and teachings are recorded in scripture, which is read by Buddhists today, such as the Dhammapada, which we're going to have a look at in just a second. Now, when he was 80 years old, so, you know, a very good age for that time, the Buddha knew that his life was at an end. Remember, he was living in this enlightened state. He was now very self-aware, and he realized that his life was now coming to an end. His body, his physical body, was frail, and he was developing serious digestive problems. And so he gave his final teaching on how everything and everyone is subject to decay, because of course that was what he was experiencing firsthand. That, you know, as he realized when he first saw those sights, when he went out of the palace for the first time, everybody will get old, get sick, and then die. And he was saying, I am a living proof of that, if you like. Even though I've attained enlightenment, I am still subject to those same processes. I am aging, I am getting sick, and I am going to die. And so he gave a teaching on this, saying to his followers, you need to accept this, you know, you need to be aware of this, and you need to make peace with this, that this is what happens in life. And so then he was surrounded by his most loyal followers, and he then did die. And so there you have the extraordinary life of the Buddha, which, you know, began with that birth into the palace, and which then ended with him founding this religion, this extraordinary religion, which is still practiced by millions of people around the world today. So a real story. We talk, don't we, in today's world about people who go from living in poverty and have nothing to becoming, multimillionaires and, really rich, wealthy people with money. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that the Buddha's story is almost in reverse, that he went from having everything and he actually left the palace and he found that that was the way to find happiness. So, again, what does this say to us in the 21st century? What messages might this contain that are still relevant for human beings today? Now, I want to share with you some of the key teachings from the Dhammapada, which, as I say, is a collection of the sayings of the Buddha, a collection of his teachings that have obviously here been translated into modern English. So I want to draw your attention straight away to verse 183, which really encapsulates the key teachings of the Buddha. And we're told this: do not what is evil, so don't do things that are evil. Do what is good. Keep your mind pure. This is the teaching of Buddha. And as I say, that really encapsulates the core messages of Buddhism and those key teachings of the Buddha. He has a lot to say, though, on sort of controlling your mind, disciplining your mind, and how that will help you to attain enlightenment and overcome suffering. He says, for example, the very first verse of the Dhammapada says, our life is a creation of our mind. He says in verse 5 that hate is not conquered by hate, hate is conquered by love. This is a law eternal. In verse 6, we're told we are here to live in this world, to live in harmony. We are told in verse 114, better than 100 years not considering how all things arise and pass away is one single day of life if one considers how all things arise and pass away. And that is, of course, a very important Buddhist teaching about dependent arising, about the way in which things do come into existence and then they go out of existence. And one of those key core Buddhist teachings is to not get overly attached to people or possessions, because everything is subject to decay. And what else does he say in verse 112? Better than 100 years lived in idleness and in weakness is a single day of life lived with courage and powerful striving. So it's all about waking up and living with courage and powerful striving, with purpose. In verse 203, we read that the hunger of passions is the greatest disease. Verse 100 says, better than 1,000 useless words is one single word that brings peace. Verse 276 says, you yourselves should make the effort in order to attain enlightenment. The enlightened ones are only teachers. So that's saying every single person must take responsibility for their own practice of the middle way and their own search and quest to find enlightenment. Verse 204 says, health is the greatest possession, contentment is the greatest treasure, and confidence is the greatest friend. We read in verse 35 that it is good to control the mind. A controlled mind brings happiness. And so a really interesting idea there about how we attain happiness. It's about controlling and disciplining our minds. Verse 187 says, when desires go, joy comes. The follower of Buddha finds this truth. And so there's this key idea in Buddhism that we're going to talk about in a moment, that in order to find true happiness, you should not be trying to fulfill your desires, so chasing after that new iPhone, that new Louis Vuitton bag, etc. Happiness actually comes when you limit your desires, when you stop desiring rather than constantly trying to fulfill them. Because if you are constantly trying to fulfill your desires, you will never be fulfilled. And then finally, from verse 202, there is no evil like hate. There is no pain like disharmony. There is no joy like nirvana. So that just gives you a flavor, I hope, of some of the key teachings of the Buddha, some of the key messages that he shared with his followers and that are now shared with us today, thanks to texts such as the Dhammapada. Interesting as well, the front cover there showing, I think, 2 feet, I want to say, which is showing that you've got to tread carefully along the middle way in order to find enlightenment. So the final thing I want to do in this video, now we've looked at the life of the Buddha, is focus on the 4 Noble Truths and then the Noble Eightfold Path, which, as we know, were taught by the Buddha after he'd attained enlightenment in his first sermon. So these are the foundational beliefs in Buddhism. They really are your core key beliefs upon which all Buddhist teaching and practice is based. So really important we know what they are. Let's get started, shall we? Number one is that life is suffering. This is what the Buddha calls the first noble truth, that life is suffering. And that is something that we've got to accept. We've got to wake up to the fact that life is suffering. And the word we use for this is dukkha. So life is suffering. Now, really important to link this to the life of the Buddha. He bases this on those three sights that he saw when he left the palace for the first time: sickness, old age, and death. And they give him the empirical evidence. They give him the confirmation that life is suffering. And that is consistent no matter who you are or where you live. Whether you live in a palace or whether you live in poverty. Every single human being is going to get sick, get old, and ultimately die. And so that is the first noble truth that the Buddha gives. The second noble truth then is about the truth and origin of suffering. So we've established, haven't we, that life is suffering. But the question now is, where does that suffering come from? What is the cause of that suffering? And the Buddha says that there are three fires or three poisons, you may have been taught them. And they are greed, hatred, and ignorance. So they are the three things that cause suffering. And you will notice that they are not external things, are they? They are things within us. And that shows us that they are completely within our control. Greed, hatred, and ignorance. They are all things within us. And so that shows you that we don't have to just say, well, we suffer and there's nothing we can do about it. Because the fact that the origin of suffering is within us ourselves shows us there is something we can do about it, which means that we can escape from it. Indeed. Number three, the third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of suffering. And cessation means to cease, the ending of suffering. And for Buddhists, this is nirvana. And you may have heard this term before. Nirvana means the extinguishing. It means the extinguishing of those fires, the fires of greed, hatred, and ignorance, and the extinguishing of attachments. So it is all about this idea that we will end our suffering when we end greed, hatred, and ignorance in our lives. So the Buddha is now prescribing us, if you like, a cure. He is telling us how we can be cured of suffering, how we can overcome it, how we can get rid of it in our lives. And that is by extinguishing those three fires that he has diagnosed as the cause of our suffering. And so he then gives us the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path to the cessation of suffering. And so in order to reach nirvana, we need to follow the middle way, which of course is all about balance, walking, treading carefully along that middle way between overindulgence and severe self-discipline. And we need to follow what is then called the Noble Eightfold Path. So this is really important because we have been given this sickness, we've been given this diagnosis, if you like, that we are suffering and that the cause of that suffering is greed, hatred, and ignorance. And then we are given the cure. We're then told what we need to do to remedy that, to get better, if you like, to overcome the problem we're faced with. And that is by extinguishing those fires. It is about extinguishing our attachments. And so you need to follow the Buddha's prescription, if you like. If we imagine him as a doctor who's diagnosed your sickness and is then giving you the cure, we need to then follow the middle way and practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And so I have made a note there for you that the Buddha is often described as the great physician. He is very much like a doctor who has diagnosed an illness. He's worked out what's making you sick, and then he's prescribed a cure for that sickness. And so it's all about healing people and helping people. And so, as I say, one of the key parts of that prescription is to practice the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is basically 8 things that you need to do in your life every day in order to attain nirvana, in order to extinguish those 3 fires and so overcome suffering. And we split these into 3 categories. They are 3 categories of things that you need to do. And we break them down into wisdom, ethics, and concentration. So in terms of wisdom, You need to focus on developing right understanding of things and right thought. So remember, Buddhism is all about controlling your mind. And so you need to make sure that you've got right thought. Now, this reminds me of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very popular therapy offered on the NHS in the UK. It was developed in the 20th century, and it's all about disputing and challenging irrational thoughts and replacing them with healthy thoughts that are rational. And so we could say there is a link here between modern psychotherapy and, ancient Buddhist teachings. This idea that it's important to have the right thoughts in order to overcome suffering. We have then ethics. We then have the next three, which are all to do with ethics. And so that's all about your conduct in the world, isn't it? It's about how you interact with other people. It's about the things that you do. These three then are right speech, so it's about the things that you say, saying words of peace, for example, rather than being hateful in your language. Right action, so it's about the things that you actually do. So, for example, refraining from killing. And then we have right livelihood, and so that's to do with how you live your life. So do you have an honourable source of income, for example? How do you actually live your life? And so they are the three ethical steps, if you like, on the Noble Eightfold Path. We finally then have the concentration component. So the final three steps on the path are right effort, to put in the right effort. We then have right mindfulness, which of course is probably what Buddhism is best known for in the West today, isn't it? Mindfulness has become a very big thing in Western culture. People wanting to develop mindfulness. I think one of the best ways of working out what mindfulness is comparing it with its opposite, which is mindlessness. So think about it. Mindfulness is about living with awareness and being anchored in the present moment, whereas mindlessness means not thinking at all, not being present. And so that can be quite a helpful way to understand what mindfulness actually is. And then finally, last but not least, is right concentration. So it's about having that concentration and concentrating on the right things as well. And remember, for the Buddha, you need to be treading carefully along the middle way and then following this Noble Eightfold Path. And that will lead to the extinguishing of the three poisons, the three fires, and that will ultimately lead to you attaining enlightenment, which is that key core focus, end goal, if you like, for Buddhists. But of course, remember, in the same way that the Buddha didn't become enlightened and leave the world, there's a key idea in Buddhism that you should attain enlightenment, and then it's your job, if you like, to have compassion for other people and then help them, teach them, remain in the world and be compassionate, be a teacher, help other people to overcome suffering themselves. So there we have it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope that's been helpful. Any questions or anything you'd add, please do comment down below. There'll be more Buddhism videos here on the channel soon, so don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you very soon. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.